the winter of 1347, after Christ brought Canterbury to its knees. And I want you to picture this for a moment. Not the sanitized medieval fantasy of tapestries and troubadours, but the actual, brutal reality of working-class life in 14th century England. The Black Death had just crossed the Channel from France, creeping westward like some invisible horror that no one understood and no one could stop. And in the fulling mills along the River Stour, women stood in water so cold it made their hands crack and bleed. The water literally ran pink. Marjorie of Canterbury was one of these women. Her fingers were numb, perpetually numb, as she pounded wool cloth against the fulling stocks, adding her voice to the ancient work songs that coordinated everyone's labour. These weren't pretty songs. They were rhythmic, functional, the medieval equivalent of sea shanties, designed to keep dozens of hands moving in unison. The mill wheels thundered constantly, and the workers couldn't stop. Not for cold, not for pain, not for anything, because a single bolt of properly fulled broadcloth that's about 40 yards of fabric meant the difference between feeding your children and watching them starve. Now, here's the economic situation that makes this whole story possible, and it's one of those historical ironies that's almost painful to contemplate. Medieval England produced the finest wool in all of Europe. We're talking about sheep that had been selectively bred for generations to produce soft, long-stapled fleece that merchants from Florence to Bruges would literally pay gold to obtain. English wool was the petroleum of the medieval economy. Everyone wanted it, everyone needed it, and England had a natural monopoly on the best quality stuff. But here's the catch. England shipped this treasure abroad as raw material and bought it back as finished cloth at 10 times the price. Think about that. You're sitting on gold, literally, and you're selling it at cost, then purchasing back the refined product at premium prices. The profitable stages of textile production, the dyeing, the fulling, the finishing, those remained the jealously guarded trade secrets of continental craftsmen in Flanders and Italy. English workers like Marjorie did the back-breaking labour, but continental producers captured the value. Fulling itself is fascinating if you've never encountered it. You take woven cloth just off the loom, it's actually quite loose and open, and you pound it and press it in water for hours, sometimes days. This tightens the weave, makes the fibres interlock, and creates that dense, weather-resistant fabric called broadcloth. It's absolutely brutal work. Your hands are in water constantly. You're swinging heavy wooden mallets, or, in mills like Marjorie's, working massive mechanical hammers, powered by water wheels. The process worked. English fullers could produce adequate broadcloth, but their results never quite matched what came back from Flemish and Italian workshops. Continental cloth draped better, lasted longer, felt more luxurious. Nobody knew why. And Marjorie lived in a world where this work carried genuine spiritual weight. This isn't just colour I'm adding, this is fundamental to understanding medieval people. The church taught that weaving and textile work reflected God's providence. Each thread was part of divine design. The Virgin Mary herself, working her spinning wheel in Nazareth, stood as patron saint to every textile worker in Christendom. To produce cloth wasn't just economic activity, it was participating in sacred creation. You were transforming chaos, in the form of raw, greasy fleece, into order and beauty. Every stage came with prayers and ritual. Women sang psalms while carding wool. They blessed their looms before beginning work. They saw in the interweaving of warp and weft a literal mirror of how God wove human souls together into the fabric of creation. But prayer doesn't warm frozen hands. Prayer doesn't mend torn cloth. Marjorie's family depended entirely on her weekly wages. 3 pence when work was steady, absolutely nothing when mills closed during plague outbreaks or wool shortages. Her husband had died the previous spring, one of thousands taken by a mysterious sweating sickness that preceded the greater pestilence everyone could feel approaching. Her 2 daughters, ages 8 and 11, worked as carders in another workshop. Their small fingers were particularly suited to the delicate task of combing wool fibres straight. The calculations were simple and brutal in their clarity. Earn wages or starve, maintain quality or lose your position, obey guild regulations or face punishment. And those guild regulations were iron chains. Canterbury's Guild of Fullers and Dyers controlled everything: prices, techniques, standards. They enforced their rules with fines, beatings, or exile for anyone who deviated. Innovation was heresy. Experimentation was theft. Every method had been passed down through generations of masters, and improvement was neither needed nor wanted. The Guild existed to preserve monopoly, not foster change. For women like Marjorie, the restrictions cut even deeper. They could work, oh yes, the Guild was happy to exploit their labour, but they could never join as full members. They could learn techniques but never teach officially. They could achieve genuine mastery of the craft but never receive formal recognition. They were essential yet invisible. On a November night, as plague bells tolled across Canterbury, that slow, deliberate tolling that announced another death, another family destroyed, Marjorie made a mistake that would literally change history. She was exhausted after 14 hours of labour. Think about that. 14 hours in freezing water, swinging heavy tools, breathing air thick with lanolin and damp wool. She left a bolt of undyed broadcloth soaking in what she thought was her standard: fulling bath water, human urine for its ammonia content, and fuller's earth clay. That was the approved formula, passed down through generations. But the wooden trough she selected had been used earlier that day for washing tallow-stained work aprons, and someone had dumped wood ash into it, rather than taking the time to carry it to the lye-making shed. When Marjorie discovered her error the next morning, she expected complete disaster. What she found instead seemed like a miracle. The cloth had transformed overnight. The weave remained tight as before, that hadn't changed, but the fabric itself had somehow changed character entirely, running it through her experienced fingers, and we're talking about hands that had touched thousands of yards of fabric, that knew wool the way a musician knows their instrument. Marjorie felt a suppleness she'd never encountered in English broadcloth. It draped like the expensive Florentine cloth she'd once touched at a merchant's market stall. Yet when she pulled hard on a corner, really testing its strength, the fabric resisted far more than it should have. Somehow, impossibly, the cloth had become simultaneously softer and tougher. Two qualities that should contradict each other, that should be mutually exclusive, were now present in the same piece of fabric. Her first instinct was pure fear. Producing cloth by unapproved methods meant charges of fraud. If guild inspectors discovered her mistake, she could lose her position, pay crushing fines that would destroy her family, possibly even face public punishment in the stocks. But Marjorie couldn't ignore what her hands were telling her. This wasn't random chance. The combination of tallow residue, wood ash, and extended soaking had triggered some fundamental transformation in the wool fibres themselves. She hid the bolt beneath other cloth and said absolutely nothing to anyone. That night she took scraps home and began careful secret experiments. Over the following weeks, as the Black Death crept closer and Canterbury's population either fled or died, Marjorie worked in shadows. She tested different ratios of wood, ash to water, different types of fat and tallow, different soaking times and temperatures. She learned that temperature mattered enormously. Warm water worked better than cold, but boiling destroyed the effect entirely. She discovered that certain batches of wood ash produced superior results, and eventually understood these came from oak rather than pine. She found that cloth needed prolonged, gentle agitation, not the violent pounding of standard fulling. Most crucially, she realized the technique required multiple treatments: a first bath to penetrate the fibers, careful controlled drying, a second bath with adjusted proportions, then final pressing with heated stones. This discovery didn't emerge from sudden inspiration or blind luck. It came from thousands of hours of experience, from hands that knew wool the way you know your Warsmar own voice. Marjorie understood her materials through touch and observation, through the accumulated knowledge of generations of craftswomen whose names would never appear in any guild record or chronicle. She worked in a tradition of female expertise that operated parallel to male authority, invisible, unrecorded, yet absolutely essential to medieval England's economy. By spring of 1348, after Christ, as plague finally reached Canterbury and death carts rattled through streets, Marjorie had perfected her technique. She'd also made a calculated decision about what to do with it. Revealing the method to guild authorities would gain her nothing. They'd simply claim it as their own discovery, and quite possibly punish her for unauthorized experimentation. Selling the secret to continental buyers would bring immediate gold, but destroy any possibility of improving English textile production. Instead, Marjorie chose a third path, one that required patience and courage and equal flow measure. She would build her own network, teach women she trusted, and prove through superior results that innovation could no longer be suppressed. But teaching this technique to others, spreading it through England's textile towns while keeping it hidden from guild authorities that would require something medieval women weren't supposed to have: power. From 1348 through 1380, after Christ, we're talking about more than 3 decades here, Marjorie's discovery spread through England's textile towns like a secret river flowing beneath official channels. And the way this knowledge transferred is absolutely crucial to understanding why it stayed hidden for so long and why it worked so well. She began with her daughters. Medieval craft knowledge didn't transfer through written manuals or instruction books. It transferred through hands and eyes. Apprentices learned by watching masters, by imitating movements, by developing what I can only call physical intuition, that gut-level understanding that separates adequate work from genuine excellence. Marjorie showed her daughters how to judge wood ash quality by texture alone, how to recognize the precise moment just by looking and touching when cloth had soaked long enough, how to feel in their fingertips the subtle difference between properly treated fabric and standard broadcloth. This wasn't information you could write down. This was embodied knowledge, lived in muscles and nerves. The network expanded through bonds of kinship and necessity, and this is where it gets strategically interesting. Marjorie's sister worked in a Norwich dyeing workshop and became the second recruit. She adapted the technique for dyed cloth and discovered something remarkable. Certain colours, particularly the expensive scarlet produced from Kermes insects, those little bugs that gave you the most prestigious red dye in medieval Europe, achieved unprecedented depth and brilliance when applied to fabric. Prepared through Marjorie's method, a widow in York who'd corresponded with Marjorie about obtaining Canterbury wool became the third member after visiting on pilgrimage to the cathedral. Marjorie demonstrated her innovation in exchange for information about northern markets. Each new member brought their own expertise and local adaptations. Yorkshire water, with its particular mineral content from flowing through different geology, required different ratios than Kentish water. The technique became plural, techniques. And here's the sophisticated part. The network operated through a strategy that balanced secrecy with practical application in a way that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. Members couldn't simply stop producing standard cloth without arousing massive suspicion, so they maintained their regular work while secretly treating select pieces with the hidden technique. These exceptional cloths entered markets without fanfare, sold through trusted merchants who asked no questions about production methods. The strategy created gradual market pressure. Buyers who'd experienced the superior fabric began specifically requesting cloth from certain workshops. Guildmasters noticed that workshops employing these particular women produced disproportionate profits, but they couldn't figure out why. The spiritual dimension remained absolutely central to how practitioners understood their work. And again, this isn't window dressing. This is how medieval people actually experienced reality. They saw the technique not as rebellion against tradition, but as revelation, God showing them a better way to fulfill their sacred duty of clothing humanity. Before each treatment bath, they prayed to the Virgin Mary for guidance. They incorporated Christian symbolism into their work, treating cloth for special customers on particular saints' days, believing the spiritual significance enhanced material results. This wasn't superstition in their minds. The spiritual and material realms interpenetrated constantly, and the transformation of wool into superior cloth paralleled the transformation of souls through divine grace. Guild authorities sensed something shifting in Canterbury's textile economy by 1360, after Christ. But they couldn't identify the cause. Certain workshops, particularly those employing experienced female fullers, consistently produced broadcloth that commanded premium prices in London and overseas markets. Inspectors examined looms and dye vats. They interrogated workers. They analyzed samples under magnification, but they found no obvious violations of approved methods. The hidden technique left no visible marks, no telltale signs, only superior performance. This information asymmetry, this gap between what the guilds knew and what was actually happening, drove guildmasters absolutely crazy. Their entire authority structure was built on monopolizing production knowledge. The first direct threat came in 1365, after Christ, when Thomas Bradwardine, master of Canterbury's Guild of Fullers and Dyers, accused several workshops of fraud. He couldn't prove they'd violated specific regulations technically. They hadn't, but the circumstantial evidence was damning. Superior cloth from workshops employing women known to associate with Marjorie. Bradwardine represented the conservative faction of guildmasters who saw any deviation from inherited practice as existential threat. And think about it from their perspective. If workers could improve techniques without guild approval, what purpose did the guild actually serve beyond collecting fees and enforcing outdated rules? Their entire reason for existing was being questioned. The confrontation escalated during the growing unrest of the 1370s. England was simmering with resentment on multiple fronts. Heavy taxation to fund endless wars with France, labour shortages following the plague, creating worker demands for higher wages. Aristocratic resistance to peasant mobility lords wanted to keep serfs tied to land, but workers had options now. And the church's enormous wealth, while common people struggled, the Statute of Labourers, passed in 1351, after Christ, had attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, despite massive worker scarcity. This created widespread anger among labourers who recognised their increased bargaining power. Textile workers, skilled and absolutely essential to England's economy, stood at the centre of these tensions. When the Peasants' Revolt exploded in June of 1381, after Christ, beginning in Essex and Kent before marching on London, the textile network faced an impossible decision. Many members sympathised deeply with rebel demands: fair wages, freedom from arbitrary authority, dignity for labourers who actually created England's wealth. Marjorie, now in her 60s, and recognised as an elder craftswoman despite her complete lack of official status, attended secret meetings where workers debated joining the uprising, but she recognised the danger with cold clarity. If the revolt failed and the odds heavily favoured royal forces, participants would face brutal retaliation. The textile network had survived more than 20 years through careful strategy, not open rebellion. Revolutionary times demanded revolutionary decisions, but Marjorie counselled a different path. And this is where her strategic brilliance really shows. As rebels occupied London and forced the young King Richard II to meet their leader, Wat Tyler, at Smithfield, Marjorie made her move in Canterbury. She approached Thomas Bradwardine directly, offering a deal. She would demonstrate her technique before assembled guildmasters in exchange for formal recognition and protection for her network. Her timing was calculated genius. With the kingdom in chaos and traditional authority structures genuinely threatened, guildmasters needed to gauge it, consolidate support among their most skilled workers. Marjorie offered them something genuinely valuable, a real innovation that could strengthen English textile dominance in European markets in exchange for something they could grant without completely losing face. Acknowledgement that improvement was possible and that women's expertise actually mattered. The demonstration took place in July, just weeks after royal forces had crushed the revolt and executed its leaders. Before an audience of guildmasters, merchants, and Canterbury's mayor, Marjorie treated a bolt of ordinary English broadcloth through each stage of her process, explaining as she worked. She'd brought samples showing the technique's results: cloth that draped beautifully, yet resisted tearing, that held dye more vibrantly than standard fabric, that could be worked thinner for summer garments or thicker for winter without losing its essential qualities. She demonstrated how the method used readily available materials, wood ash, animal fats, and time, no expensive imports, no exotic ingredients. Most importantly, she showed that the technique enhanced rather than replaced traditional fulling. It built on inherited wisdom rather than rejecting it. The guildmasters faced their own strategic calculation. They could reject Marjorie's innovation, maintain rigid control, and risk losing their most talented workers to other textile centres where innovation found more welcome. Or they could accept the technique, claim credit for approving rather than discovering it, and strengthen Canterbury's competitive position in European markets. Economic incentive overcame institutional pride. Bradwardine himself, recognizing the technique's value and seeing opportunity for substantial profit, became an unexpected advocate. By autumn of 1381 after Christ, the technique had received grudging official acceptance, though Marjorie and her network never received formal guild membership or the legal protections granted to male masters. The compromise satisfied no one completely, but it achieved Marjorie's essential goal. The hidden technique could now spread openly through England's textile towns, no longer requiring secrecy or risking punishment. The network had won through patience, strategic timing, and offering value too great to refuse, and now the real transformation could begin. The century following 1385. After Christ witnessed English broadcloth's transformation from adequate commodity to Europe's absolute gold standard. And when I say gold standard, I mean that almost literally this stuff became as valuable as precious metal in international trade. Marjorie's technique, now practiced openly if still incompletely documented, became England's secret weapon in what was essentially commercial warfare. The nation that had once shipped raw wool to continental workshops and brought back finished cloth now dominated European textile markets. And the hidden technique evolved, refined, adapted across dozens of workshops and hundreds of skilled hands, provided the crucial competitive advantage. The technique generated multiple compounding benefits that fed into each other. First, cost reduction. Producing superior results with cheaper materials and less skilled labour meant English cloth could undercut continental prices while maintaining or exceeding quality. Second, product differentiation. English broadcloth acquired distinctive characteristics: a particular hand feel, superior drape, exceptional durability that buyers recognized and specifically valued. Third, flexibility. The method worked across wool grades, from the finest fleece destined for royal garments down to coarser wool for common clothing. These advantages created powerful feedback loops. Textile profits funded expansion of sheep farming across England's countryside, increasing raw material supply. Commercial success attracted skilled workers from Flanders and Italy, bringing additional expertise that combined with English methods. Export revenues generated capital for workshop expansion and equipment improvement. And England's cloth reputation created premium pricing power. People would pay more simply because it was English. National policy reinforced these market advantages in ways that show how important textiles had become to England's entire economy. Edward III and his successors recognized textiles as a pillar, maybe the pillar of English economic power. Royal legislation restricted raw wool exports, forcing foreign buyers to purchase finished cloth instead. Tax incentives encouraged domestic textile production. Immigration policies actively welcomed continental craftspeople with textile skills. Protective tariffs shielded English producers from foreign competition. The Crown granted monopolies and privileges to textile guilds, strengthening their control over quality and training. Some economic historians estimate that by 1420, after Christ, cloth and wool accounted for over half of England's export revenue. Over half, making textiles more important to the national economy than any other sector except agriculture itself. The technique continued evolving through 3 generations of practitioners. What Marjorie discovered in desperation, her successors refined through systematic experimentation. Workshops in different regions adapted the basic method to their particular circumstances. Yorkshire developed variations for their local wool breeds. Norfolk specialised in worsted cloth applications. That's a different weave structure that required its own adaptations. And the Cotswolds became renowned for treatment methods that produced especially lustrous fabric that caught light beautifully. The technique had branched into a family of related practices, each suited to specific products and markets, all tracing their ancestry back to Marjorie's original discovery in that cold Canterbury workshop. Eleanor of Norwich emerged as the technique's greatest practitioner in the early 1500s. Born in 1395 after Christ to a family of textile workers, Eleanor apprenticed under her mother and grandmother, both members of Marjorie's original network. By age 25, Eleanor ran her own workshop employing 16 workers and specializing in the absolute finest broadcloth. Her innovations extended the hidden technique into new territory. She discovered that treating cloth multiple times with progressively refined baths, each one slightly different in composition, created a fabric of almost silk-like smoothness while maintaining all of wool's warmth and durability. It shouldn't have been possible, but she made it work. Her masterwork came in 1425 after Christ, when she produced cloth for King Henry VI's coronation robes. The fabric was so perfect that witnesses literally described it as miraculous. The 7-year-old king wore garments that draped like water yet reportedly could have stopped a dagger thrust. Eleanor's reputation spread across Europe after that. But here's the thing about success. It breeds envy and espionage. Italian and Flemish merchants watched their market share erode to English competitors and launched systematic campaigns to discover the source of English cloth's superiority. The hidden technique, though no longer strictly secret in England, remained poorly understood on the continent. Foreign buyers who examined finished English cloth couldn't reverse engineer the production process. The technique left no obvious traces in the final product, only results. Italian city-states and Flemish towns offered enormous bounties. We're talking life-changing sums of money for craftspeople willing to reveal English methods. And some textile workers succumbed to temptation. The most dramatic case came in 1467, after Christ, when Florentine merchant princes targeted a Bristol dyer named William Canninges. They correctly suspected that dyers understood the full production chain, including finishing techniques. Florentine agents approached Canninges with an offer: 10,000 florins. To put that in perspective, that's enough gold to live as a gentleman for life. Never work another day. In exchange, they wanted complete documentation of English cloth finishing methods. Canninges accepted the bribe, collected the gold, and prepared to board a Venetian galley for Italy. Bristol's guild discovered the plot just days before his departure. What followed was one of medieval England's few really well-documented cases of commercial espionage, and it reads like a thriller. Guild authorities arrested Canninges and confiscated his gold. They interrogated him about what information he'd already provided, under pressure, and we don't know if this was actual torture or just threat of execution. Canninges revealed he'd sent written descriptions of the technique to Florence months earlier. The documents were already in transit. English merchants in Italy received urgent instructions to intercept these documents by any means necessary. This led to bribes, thefts, and at least one documented dagger fight in a Florentine alley between English and Italian agents. Whether the documents ultimately reached their intended recipients remains unknown, but Florentine cloth quality did show marked improvement in the 1470s, which suggests at least partial success. These episodes revealed an uncomfortable truth that Marjorie herself probably understood from the beginning. Monopolies on knowledge can't last forever. The hidden technique was spreading beyond English control no matter what anyone did. Yet England maintained its dominant position through accumulated advantages. Decades of experience had created a skilled workforce impossible to replicate quickly. Textile towns had developed supporting infrastructure, wool markets, finishing workshops, dye, suppliers, merchant networks that created efficient production clusters. English wool itself remained superior raw material, and domestic producers had first access to the best fleeces. And brand reputation mattered enormously. Buyers associated English broadcloth with quality and trusted it for important purposes. Even as continental producers learned the technique's basics, they struggled to match actual English results. The Golden Age reached its height in the late 15th century. England's textile towns, Norwich, York, Salisbury, the Cotswold villages, and Canterbury itself, prospered beyond anything Marjorie could have imagined in that cold workshop back in 1347. Fullers and weavers built substantial stone houses that still stand today. Guild halls rose as monuments to textile wealth, decorated with stained glass windows, showing scenes of cloth production and displaying elaborate tapestries woven by members. Textile workers formed the backbone of England's prime, urban middle class, economically secure, politically influential. The craft that had once meant frozen hands and poverty wages now offered a genuine pathway to prosperity. But the foundations were shifting. By 1480, after Christ, the technique had spread sufficiently across Europe that English advantages were eroding. Italian producers, combining the hidden technique with their superior dyeing skills, they really were better at dyes, created luxury cloth that matched or even exceeded English quality. Flemish workshops adapted the method to linen production, opening entirely new markets the English hadn't considered. The competitive landscape was changing fundamentally, and England's monopoly on innovation was ending. The stage was set for the next transformation, from jealously guarded secret to common knowledge, from English specialty to European standard practice. And surprisingly, the catalyst would be English pride rather than foreign theft. The transformation began, not with foreign espionage, but with English pride. And the man responsible was John Winchicombe of Newbury, called Jack by his contemporaries. In 1489 after Christ, Jack made a decision that absolutely shocked the textile community. He published a partial description of the hidden technique in a treatise on English manufacturing. And Jack was no traitor. He was a new breed of manufacturer entirely, a self-made man who'd built a textile operation, employing over 200 workers and producing cloth for both domestic and export markets. He believed something radical for his time, that the age of secrets had ended, that England's future lay in transparent excellence rather than jealously guarded monopolies. His reasoning reflected early modern thinking beginning to challenge medieval guild mentality. And this intellectual shift is fascinating because you can see the Renaissance starting to change how people thought about knowledge itself. Jack argued that sharing knowledge would cement England's reputation as the centre of textile innovation, attracting talent and investment rather than driving them away. He believed English advantages, superior wool, skilled workforce, efficient production systems mattered more than any single technique. Most radically, he thought competition and open exchange of ideas would spur further innovation, creating sustained progress rather than stagnant monopoly. This was heresy to guild masters raised in medieval traditions, but it was becoming orthodox thinking among younger manufacturers. His treatise explained the technique's general principles: the importance of alkaline treatment through wood ash compounds, the value of prolonged gentle processing rather than violent fulling, the benefits of animal fats in conditioning wool fibers, the necessity of multiple treatment stages. He provided enough detail that experienced textile workers could experiment effectively, but he stopped short of revealing specific ratios and precise methods that required hands-on experience to master. It was a calculated release of information. The reaction split England's textile community right down the middle. Traditional guild masters condemned Jack as a traitor, claiming he'd sold English birthright for personal glory. They predicted economic catastrophe. Continental producers would steal the technique, English cloth would lose its premium pricing, and textile workers would suffer unemployment and poverty. But younger manufacturers and progressive craftspeople celebrated his decision, arguing that secrecy bred stagnation while openness encouraged improvement. They pointed out something important. The technique had already spread beyond England's borders through espionage and worker mobility. Jack's publication simply acknowledged reality rather than creating it. Both sides proved partially correct, which is often how these things work out. Continental producers did rapidly adopt Jack's published methods. Within 2 decades, Venetian and Florentine workshops produced cloth matching English quality. Flemish weavers integrated the technique into their linen production, creating entirely new fabric types the English hadn't imagined. French manufacturers focused on luxury adaptations, treating silk and fine wool blends with modified versions of the process. But rather than destroying English textile industry as the traditionalists predicted, this diffusion actually expanded the entire European market. Better, cheaper cloth, increased demand across all economic classes. The technique spread raised quality standards continent-wide, and England maintained a strong position through its accumulated advantages: skilled workforce, production infrastructure, wool supply control, and brand reputation built over more than a century. The Reformation added another layer of transformation that nobody could have predicted. When Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1533, after Christ, he triggered religious and social upheaval that shattered medieval institutions. Guild structures, intimately tied to the Catholic Church through patron saints and religious rituals, faced Protestant skepticism about traditional authority. Religious refugees, Protestant craftspeople fleeing Catholic persecution, and later Catholic workers escaping Protestant regions carried skills across borders, massively accelerating knowledge diffusion. Some of England's most innovative textile producers by mid-century were Flemish Protestants who'd settled in Norwich, bringing continental techniques that combined with English methods to create entirely new hybrids. By the mid-16th century, the hidden technique had ceased being hidden in any meaningful sense. It had become standard practice, taught openly in workshops, described in increasingly detailed treatises, adapted and modified by craftspeople across Europe. What Marjorie discovered through accident and desperation had transformed into fundamental textile technology, so thoroughly integrated into production that practitioners no longer thought of it as a special technique, but simply as proper method. The knowledge that required absolute secrecy in 1347, after Christ, was commonplace by 1550. After Christ, taken for granted by workers who never knew cloth had once been made differently. Yet the technique's influence extended far beyond its active use, and this is where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. The production methods pioneered in medieval English workshops established patterns that shaped textile manufacturing for centuries. The emphasis on chemical treatment to modify fibre properties prefigured industrial textile finishing. The multi-stage processing approach, initial treatment, drying, secondary treatment, final pressing, became the standard structure for fabric production that persists to this day. Most significantly, the innovation model, itself incremental improvement by practitioners, network-based development and refinement, eventual diffusion, despite efforts at control, foreshadowed how technological advancement would work in modern industrial society. Elements of the technique persisted in regional traditions long after their origins were completely forgotten. Particular finishing methods survived in Yorkshire, specific water treatments in the Cotswolds, folk practices maintained because "this is how grandmother taught me," even when practitioners couldn't explain why these methods worked. 19th century textile industrialists, developing chemical finishing processes for factory production, unknowingly echoed principles Marjorie had discovered 5 centuries earlier. Victorian engineers analysing medieval cloth samples marvelled at technical sophistication they struggled to replicate even with modern equipment. The technique found unexpected resurrection in the late 19th century through William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. Morris, reacting against industrial production's ugliness and brutal worker exploitation, studied medieval textile methods as models of honest craftsmanship. He experimented with natural dyes and traditional finishing techniques, attempting to recover lost knowledge. While Morris never precisely reconstructed Marjorie's process too much had been genuinely lost to time, he captured its spirit: patient handwork, deep attention to material properties, integration of art and utility. In the 21st century, textile historians and craftspeople continue working to reconstruct medieval techniques through experimental archaeology. They examine surviving fabric samples with electron microscopes, analysing fibre structure for clues about production methods. They test period recipes and techniques, discovering through actual hands-on practice what written sources don't adequately explain. A small but dedicated community of artisans practices reconstructed medieval textile methods, not from nostalgia, but from genuine appreciation for the sophistication of pre-industrial craft knowledge. At a heritage textile centre in Yorkshire, a weaver demonstrates medieval fulling to visitors. She pounds wool cloth in a wooden trough, explaining how medieval workers processed fabric, describing the hard labour and skilled judgment required. She doesn't know Marjorie's name, that particular memory was lost centuries ago, but she preserves something more important: the understanding that innovation emerges from experience, that knowledge lives in hands as much as in books, and that anonymous craftspeople through patient experimentation have always been humanity's greatest innovators. When visitors touch the finished cloth, feeling its softness and strength, they connect across 7 centuries to that cold winter morning when a desperate Canterbury worker discovered that her mistake had created something wonderful. They're touching the fences, the same kind of fabric that clothed medieval kings and common labourers alike, fabric that helped build England's prosperity, fabric that changed how humanity understood the relationship between materials and process. Marjorie of Canterbury never became famous. No statues commemorate her, no contemporary chronicles recorded her name. She died sometime in the early 1400s, probably in the same modest circumstances in which she'd lived most of her life, but her legacy persists in ways she never could have imagined. In the structure of modern textiles, in the methods of chemical finishing, in the understanding that innovation often comes not from those with power and recognition, but from those with skill and necessity. And perhaps most importantly, in the reminder that history isn't just made by kings and generals, by famous inventors and celebrated artists. It's made by ordinary people solving immediate problems, by workers who understand their materials deeply, by women who experiment in shadows and build networks in silence, by hands that know, even when official records refuse to acknowledge what those hands have created. That's the real story. Not just of a technique that made fabrics softer and tougher, but of how knowledge moves through the world, how innovation actually happens, and how the invisible work of uncounted thousands shapes the world we inherit.